So, how do you predict a natural disaster using Vedic astrology? Recently, there's been a lot of hurricanes happening throughout the US and throughout Mexico, and this is something that happens regularly. So, how do you predict when it's going to happen and how do you plan for it? Well, I'm going to share the quick answer is that I can predict there will be a hurricane every week this year. There will be a hurricane this week. And next week, I can say there will also be a hurricane. There will also be a flood this week. There will also be a tornado this week. There will also be multiple earthquakes this week. There will also be a volcanic eruption this week because these things are very common. So there's not one particular astrological factor that says this week will be an earthquake or this week will be a hurricane or whatever the thing is. So the short answer, how to predict a natural disaster using astrology, is just to say that it will happen this week. There will be a natural disaster this week. And if you want to see this yourself, you can go to the website zoom.earth. This is a weather forecasting site. It has nothing to do with like the Zoom meeting app, but zoom.earth, you can see there are usually multiple hurricanes going on, tropical storms that become hurricanes. If you're watching the video, I'm showing several of them happening just a couple of days ago. And they move quickly, they change quickly, they're a bit unpredictable. Sometimes there's several happening at once, several starting at once. And you can look around the world and you'll see there are many happening. But you might not hear about them unless they're affecting somebody close to you or somebody in your country or something like that. So how do you predict those ones? What about the ones that affect you and your country? Well, one thing you could do is look at the birth chart of your country and then look at the transits over the country. But that's still pretty rough to predict because we're talking about in the United States a very big landmass. And to say that all of that is going to be affected by a natural disaster, it's tricky. It's not the most accurate thing, it's not the most reliable thing. So, natural disaster, what is a natural disaster? It's anything, an event such as a flood, earthquake, or hurricane that causes great damage or loss of life. So, a natural event such as a flood, earthquake, or hurricane that causes great damage or loss of life. That's a natural disaster. So, how do we predict when they're happening? Well, they're happening all the time. And part of this is that there's more tracking now than ever, like sites like this, like zoom.earth, which is taking satellite imagery every 10 minutes roughly. They're getting a new picture from space of the whole Earth. And it's more tracked now than ever. So we have more data and more knowledge of when they're happening, which historically we wouldn't have. So it may seem like we're having more now than ever, but it's more likely that it's just that we're tracking it better than ever. So we're seeing all of them that happen, all the natural disasters, rather than that there's necessarily more of them. And these tropical cyclones that can become hurricanes, there's 80 to 100 of those a year. So again, basically every week there's one or two of them or more of these tropical cyclones happening every week of the year on average. And astrologers who predict natural disasters can easily find one somewhere in the world and say they're predicting a natural disaster next week, and then next week they come back and say, well, I told you that would happen because of this placement, but they don't acknowledge the one that happened the week before and the one that's happening next week and the one that happened 2 weeks before and 3 weeks before, because these things happen all the time. So zoom.earth is where you can see things like that, like tropical storms and tropical cyclones, things like that. Floods happen to be the most common natural disaster. There's over 60,000 floods a year, and 100 to 200 of those are major floods, like major disasters. There's over 5,800 wildfires a year. There's 15,000, excuse me, there's over, maybe I said this wrong, 60,000 plus floods, 58,000 plus wildfires, 15,000 plus earthquakes, 1,200 plus tornadoes, 80 to 100 plus tropical cyclones, 60 to 80 volcanic eruptions. So again, in any given week, you'll be 100% accurate to predict that one of the above will happen. But what can be more valuable is to predict where it will happen and to look at a region and see if there's some sort of indicator of a natural disaster coming at that time. And some astrologers use certain placements to predict this, like the Gandanta transits, when a planet is moving from a water to a fire sign. can be a natural disaster, like from Pisces to Aries, or from Cancer to Leo, right? These are from water to fire signs that happen regularly. All planets move along this progression except Rahu and Ketu, which go backwards through the signs. But what's interesting is there are only 2 to 3 significant tsunamis a year. As far as natural disasters, a tsunami, there's only 2 to 3 major ones a year, around 20, 10 to 20 that are detected annually, but only 2 to 3 that are significant. So, in general, any coastline near tectonic boundaries or areas of significant underwater seismic activity are at risk for tsunamis, with the Pacific and Indian Oceans being the most susceptible areas. Typically, a tsunami is when there's an 8.5 or higher earthquake near a coast. And the deadliest one recorded was in 2004, which affected 14 countries, and there was over 280,000 people lost in that one. But again, if we want to say, how do we predict this kind of thing? We want to overlay it over a region or a country. You look at the country's birth chart, look at the transits. But this affected 14 countries. And these are not new countries. They're potentially hundreds of thousands of years old, so that people were occupying this land. Potentially, you look at more recent incorporations of the countries, things like this. It's just all very much a gray area. And with 14 countries, you might say, oh, it's because they're having this transit of, let's say, K2 going through Aries back to Pisces. So it's bringing this flood. And we look at the one country and it's in their first house. We look at the next country, it's in their second house. We look at the next country, it's over their third house. So with 14 countries, you might have this transit happening over every house. So again, very weak predictor. Now, one thing I did look at is all of the tsunamis, the major tsunamis of history, to try to find a pattern. So if you're watching the video, I've got all those charts of six most significant tsunamis in history. And I don't have the exact time because they happen over several hours, sometimes several days. Basically, there's an initial shock wave, but there's tremors before, tremors after, there's waves after. Tsunamis can last a long time. But I've got the 6 major ones on there and the time that they happened, the region they happened, and what's happening in the astrology on that day. And there's no very strong correlation. And we just have 6 data points here, so it's kind of weak. Whenever I do research, I like to see at least 10 validations of something, like 10 charts for a tsunami, and they all have the same predictor or similar predictors. But I don't see that for these 6. And there are some other tsunamis I could look at, but they're just way less significant than these. So I think there are weak data points as well. So this episode is a little bit of a clickbait title, unfortunately. I wish there was a better way to predict in a more sound way. And maybe I don't know. And I'm open to finding different answers. I'm open to always learning. But in my research and analysis, I find that there's just not one particular strong indicator of a natural disaster other than knowing statistically they're going to happen on average every week. And tsunamis only 2 to 3 times a year, but it's actually really the major ones are way further apart than that. Like the last really major one was 2004. So almost 20 years ago now. And I think if we try to predict tsunamis with any of these data points, I think it's just too weak to predict anything. So you can look at these charts. Maybe somebody watching in the video will see something I didn't see, but I did not see any strong connection or pattern here that could point to something I could predict going forward and say, okay, on this date in the future, we're going to see a similar pattern, and then we'll be able to predict this. That's what I look for when being able to make predictions. I want to see a clear pattern throughout history and then see that if it repeats again in the future, that same pattern, that's the day I could predict this thing will happen again. So I do have that for a lot of things in astrology, but not for natural disasters. So again, if you have something I'm not seeing, and I've tested a lot of the other theories I've seen out there. So if you have something, maybe I have tested it, but I've not found anything that's reliable and accurate to say this. One thing I did see that is a little bit strong here is a lot of Ardra, a lot of Gemini energy. So we got Mars and Ardra on one of those. We got full moon and Ardra in one of those on the Indian Ocean, the biggest one. And we have seen through history that there are major events happening on the Rahu and Ketu in Ardra transit with Ketu and Mula. So when Rahu and Ketu are there, that's when we saw 9/11, Chernobyl, the 2020 pandemic. The Mula Ardra connection is quite intense. And I've talked about this on other episodes in the past. So we did see that at least in 2 of these, and we've got Gemini placements in 5 out of 6. So Gemini in general can sometimes point to these big changes and these sort of tipping of the universe into different direction, sometimes catastrophic, but mostly in the Ardra Nakshatra, which is the symbol of a teardrop and often brings sorrows and challenges, like we saw with the aforementioned events. But we don't see that in all the charts here. We see Mars in Ardra and full moon in Ardra in just 2 of these we've got. But 5 are Gemini placements. So that's a little bit of something. And we got Mula placements in 4 of them. So that's something too. With Mula, there can be this uprooting, this destructive energy that can happen there as well. So that's something, generally with Mula Ardra placements, because Mula and Ardra are always opposite, not wholly opposite, but generally if something like Rahu's in, like in this case, we see Ketu's in Mula and Rahu's in Mrigashira, right? So they're not fully opposite because Rahu could be in Ardra while Ketu's in Mula. So when we have Ketu Mula placements, that's typically a major event that changes society in some way, uproots things, as we saw with the Indian Ocean full moon there. But a full moon like that happens very regularly. So it's not a huge deal to say full moon in Ardra is going to be a catastrophic event or a tsunami. That's not true. But we do see this as the Indian Ocean tsunami has some pretty intense stuff with like full moon in Ardra. Mercury is ruled by Scorpio, which is an enemy sign, which is Scorpio is ruled by Mars, which is in Scorpio, and Mars is the final dispositor for the whole chart. And Mars is a trigger for big events, destructive events, wars, cataclysmic events. So whenever we see big Mars transits, we often see big triggers of events. So we could say this Indian Ocean tsunami having the full moon in Ardra ruled by Mars, which is dominating the whole chart, and it's the most dominant planet in the chart, and it's the final dispositor for the chart, and it's in Scorpio, and we got Mercury in Scorpio also, which is enemy sign, ruling that full moon. So those are some things that could point to destructive intensity at that time, and that's we can't use the ascendant, we can't use the houses because we don't have the exact time, right? So anytime we're looking at events like this, I can't say, oh, the ascendant's in Bharani, which is birth and death. It could be, it's possible, but we don't have the exact time on this when the Indian Ocean tsunami really happened. And I think it's a weak data point to even try to say there is a time, even if you look at the first shock wave to hit the land. I think the tsunami is forming for days before that, and the tectonic plates are shifting for many years, long time before that. So it's not the strongest indicator either. But we can say on this date is when it happened and say, okay, now we are having a tsunami. We weren't having one yesterday. Now we are having one. That was that date on December 26, 2004. So those are some of the things I see there. And looking at tsunamis, looking at natural disasters. Again, I wish I had a better, firmer indicator and say this is the thing, but I don't. And I would love to see more research if anyone does have one, if anyone can recommend one. But the things I've looked at and tested are not strong indicators. But what we can say reliably, consistently, is on average, there will be a natural disaster this week and next week and the next week. And we will do our best to try to stay on top of it. Like if you can use a site like zoom.earth, you can see when they're forming, when they're coming. I live in a region that was nearly hit by a hurricane this year, but it kept shifting. It was suddenly going left, suddenly going right, suddenly going south, suddenly going north. They change quite unpredictably, and the meteorologists do their best to try to predict it. But you just kind of have to watch it run its course and then prepare for that if it's in your region. Other natural disasters, not as easy to prepare for, but hurricanes is one that we can track ahead like this pretty well. So we have that tool at least for zoom.earth. So that's it. That's what I have to share about how to predict a natural disaster. A little disappointing, honestly. So hopefully, at least there's some perspective of knowing that it's not the simplest thing to predict, and it's not the best tool to use astrology for. And but astrology can predict so many other things and so valuable for understanding ourselves. But I would just be very skeptical of saying that it can accurately predict natural disasters. And I think it's very important to be skeptical of anything you're learning and test it all out. And I'm proudly, happily say if something doesn't work, or if I change my opinion, or I find something doesn't work, I want to find the truth in what does work. And that's what I share in my predictions and readings. And everything I'm going to share now about this week's major transits is based on many, many charts of research, thousands of charts of research and pattern recognition to find the patterns. So I can say that this week, what's happening, we can kind of work with these energies and know what to expect. So the first major transit happening this week on October 12th is Venus moving into Scorpio for 24 days. Venus, the planet of love, beauty, relationships, in the deep, intense waters of Scorpio, is considered an enemy placement for Venus to be in. And it's where Venus, the planet of love, beauty, harmony, relationships, can get into conflict, sudden ups and downs, unpredictability, changes, and intensity. Now, this could be conflict in relationships, and conflict is not always bad. It's just how you navigate it. So, being an enemy placement is now Venus has got to deal with conflict, challenges, sudden unpredictable events, changes in your travel plans, changes in your home environment, changes in the weather, changes in your mood. And Venus can make great art from that. So, might connect to your ability to express art in a way that is deep, intense, heavy, dark, and bring out parts of your communication and your relationships to address difficult, challenging things. Conflict. Every relationship has some level of conflict, but it's how you navigate the conflict that really matters. So, communicating well might be a little more difficult at this time with Venus and Scorpio, but it's helped out tremendously by Mercury in Libra. So the communication in a balanced diplomatic way can help you overcome the conflict in relationship. And conflict is necessary for growth, and challenge is necessary for growth. So we all came into being born through a very intense process of birth. It's very painful and intense, very Scorpio kind of experience. But we kind of fear those things sometimes in our lives and avoid that challenge and conflict. But especially Venus in Vishaka Nakshatra is about going after the goal, going after the challenge, and being determined to figure it out. Vishaka is ruled by Jupiter, so there's an expansive potential here. Go into the challenge, go into the intensity, and bring out the gift, the lesson. Go after the goal and do the necessary things to get to the goal. If you watch any movie, what makes it interesting is that they've got to overcome adversity. If there's no adversity or antagonist in a movie, no challenges, it's a very boring movie. Nothing really happens. It's like watching paint dry. But when you add desire, Venus, you want something, and then there's challenges, Scorpio, something in the way of that thing, and something you've got to deal with, now it's more interesting. And we pay to watch that, and we pay to be entertained by that. And sometimes we avoid that in our own lives. But if we address it in our own lives, then the entertainment is actually less entertaining and less interesting sometimes, where we actually got plenty to do in our own lives, plenty to address and not check out and distract ourselves. Entertainment's great, nothing wrong with entertainment, but sometimes it can become this sort of distraction and thing that takes us away from actually addressing the actual issues in our own lives. So Venus and Scorpio gives us an opportunity to connect to our desire. What do we really want? What do we want to go for? And what's in the way, and address those issues. And it makes life more interesting, more fun, more challenging, more conflict sometimes, more difficult sometimes, scarier sometimes. But ultimately, that's what I think we're wired for and drawn towards as humans, to grow and learn. And that's why every movie has this, every story has this, because it pulls us into that thing that's relatable inside of ourselves, of overcoming adversity to meet a goal, to move towards something we care about. Next major transit is Sun moving into Libra on October 16th, which of course is during the election season in the US. And 49% of countries in the world are having their elections in this last quarter of the year. So a lot of elections happening, a lot of change happening in government in the world. And if you're not familiar with Mexican politics, they've got their first female presidenta happening now in Mexico. It's very cool. She was sworn in with this amazing ceremony with the indigenous people. Now, I don't know all the politics. Maybe she's actually a terrible person and people don't like her or whatever, just like in the US politics, everyone's so divided. But I have never seen a president be sworn in with indigenous ceremony, and they use copal, like sage, to smudge her and call in the directions before her inauguration. And this is not something we've ever seen in the US. Imagine that in the US, if Native Americans were smudging the US president and calling in the directions and honoring the US president coming in. It's like mind blowing to even fathom that. Like that's when I was a kid, that's what gave me hope for the world, that kind of thing. I grew up in this inner city in St. Paul, Minnesota, and I was very fortunate to go to this school called an all nations school where we celebrated all different cultures. And I still hold that sort of hope for the world. Like, what if we celebrated all the different cultures? And there's an element of Sun and Libra like this, of finding the balance. Like, the best use of Sun and Libra is diplomacy and delegation, teamwork, collaboration. So while this transit's happening for 29 days, October 16th until middle November, it's a great time for finding more collaboration, connection, diplomacy in your life, teamwork. Teamwork makes the dream work, as they say. And Sun in Libra is about considering, what does everybody need here? What's in the best interest for the collective, for the group, for the relationship? Libra, of course, is very much about the scales of justice and balance and fairness. Sun and Libra people do very well in positions of judgment, of choosing what is fair, like a judge or law and politics. Ideally, you actually, what's really nice to have people in politics with Sun and Libra. They often don't do very well, though, because politics is so corrupt in a lot of ways. So we see a lot more Gemini, a lot more Aries in politics, where it's about ego, a lot more Leo. We see ego in politics, and we see corruption and two-faced energy, like the dark side of Aries, Gemini, and Leo in politics a lot more. But it'd be great to have more Libra energy there, more fairness, more justice, more balance. So on a personal level with this transit, it's a great time to bring your life into more balance, work-life balance, self-other balance, spending too much time with other people, not enough time with yourself. This is a time to reorient, shift the scales. And if it's a time where if you've been spending too much time in your parasympathetic nervous system, rest and digest, or too much time in your sympathetic nervous system, active mode, it's a good time to bring that into balance as well. And think of it like a seesaw with the nervous system. It's more like a seesaw than scales, where you actually want to tip the seesaw up and down in about 90-minute cycles throughout the day if you can, the ultradian rhythm. And you'll notice this through your nostrils. This is a yogic practice to be aware of what nostril is dominant, which nadi, we call it in yoga practice. The nadis are the energy channels. So you can check right now, either your left or right nostril is easier to breathe through. So if it's your right nostril, it's easier to breathe through. Your left hemisphere is more active, more dominant right now, and vice versa. If your left nostril is easier to breathe through, then your right hemisphere is more active, dominant. And when the left hemisphere / right nostril is more dominant, that's the time for more sympathetic nervous system activities, action, learning, being productive, getting stuff done, type A kind of stuff. And then vice versa, the opposite. So when you have the more left nostril dominance, your right hemisphere is dominant, you're more in the parasympathetic mode, the rest and digest mode. So the seesaw is tipped that way, and that's the times you take a nap, to get a massage, to rest, to go for a walk, to just chill out, to just relax, meditate, do yoga, do things that are less active, less cerebral, less intense, and be more relaxed. So Sun in Libra this time of the year is an opportunity to balance ourselves out. And then the last big transit, notably this week, is on Thursday, October 17th. We've got the full moon in Ashwini in Aries. Ashwini is the first of the 27 nakshatras or lunar mansions. So there's, with a solar cycle, the 12 signs of the zodiac, Aries through Pisces. And then there's the 27 nakshatras of the moon, more marking the lunar phase of about 27 days, and versus the solar phase of about 12 months. And when the moon is in Ashwini and we're starting that cycle again energetically of the full moon here, excuse me, not starting, but completing a cycle here energetically. Full moon is a time of completion. New moons are a time of starting, which we just had 2 weeks ago at the end of the eclipse. The last eclipse of this season was the new moon 2 weeks ago. A time where now through October, we're starting on a new path in life. Now we get to this full moon on October 17th, a time of celebration of what you've started, what you've begun in life, a time of acknowledging gratitude is very important. What you appreciate appreciates in value. So as we take time on October 17th to appreciate what we have appreciates in value. The universe provides more because we're saying yes, yes, yes to this. The universe doesn't understand no, it only understands what you put attention on. So if you go to Google and you just say, don't give me results about Kuwait, it's just going to give you results about Kuwait or whatever you type. Don't give me results about apples, it'll give you results about apples. This is a bad metaphor because you can actually put like minus apples, or there's a certain way you could type in Google where it actually will take away that word. So that's not the best example, but generally the universe responds to, if you're talking about apples, you're going to find apples. If you talk about a red car, you're going to start seeing red cars everywhere. If you're focused on a motorcycle, you're going to start seeing motorcycles everywhere. So the universe is giving us this opportunity on the full moon to acknowledge what we want to acknowledge. What have we harvested in this lunar cycle of the last month? And really, since the last time moon was in Ashwini. So it's giving us this time to celebrate what we've created, what we've started. Ashwini is about starting, creating things. It's also about healing things. So what have we healed in our lives and that we want to acknowledge, that we've grown and learned from? And it's also a powerful time for receiving healing work, like getting a massage. I booked a massage for myself that day on the full moon. A good day to receive support and nourishment in some way. Ashwini is about healing ourselves, but it's also about this powerful energy of the horse to take action and begin things. So it's that beginning energy on the full moon of completion energy. So maybe a little bit push-pull kind of thing happening here, as I talked about in the monthly horoscope, on top of the Venus and Scorpio, all the other things. There's a lot of stuff around this day of October 16, 17, 18. If you have any sort of high stress situation, being back with family or needing to communicate a difficult thing, try to just let cooler heads prevail around 16th, 17th, 18th, even to 19th, because there may be some heightened intensity, heightened anger, heightened sensitivity at that time. So if you can do things for like self-care, nourishment, and get that energy out in a positive way, that's very helpful here. Again, like the seesaw of your nervous system, going to sympathetic, active, getting stuff done, to parasympathetic, resting, relaxing, getting that active energy out through like exercise, working out, running, sprinting, physical work, things like this around these days is very helpful. And then if you're getting triggered, reactive, try to move the energy out in a constructive way. And then make sure you balance the seesaw by going up and down throughout the day, taking time to rest, taking time to be active, and roughly every 90 minutes. Sometimes it's about 2 hours, but you'll notice your nostrils change. If you want to track it throughout the day, you'll see that it's about 90 minutes to 2 hours. And when one is more dominant, you can shift into those kind of activities. So let's look at the transits happening this week and our look again at the how to predict a natural disaster, which is basically it's going to happen every week. It's going to be one. And how do you know if it's going to hit your region? Well, we don't have any strong indicators of that necessarily. How do you know if it's going to affect you personally? Well, then you look at your own chart, you schedule a reading with an experienced astrologer, and you can see, yes, there might be some major events happening in your life. We can look at things like finding you're in the Sadhisati. There's going to be more challenges and obstacles. We can see you're in the Dasha Sandhi. You're in a transitional time where things are unstable. We can see that there might be a lot of losses if there's a lot of transits over your 12th house. So on a personal level, yes, you can see that there will be issues or impact from some sort of big event, but whether it's a natural disaster or personal choice or some other event, it's a little bit harder to see through the astrology, but we can see the general vicinity of it pretty well. But actually predicting a specific natural disaster to hit a specific person, not so much. but personal life changes, absolutely. And the nature of those changes, absolutely. So that's what you can expect in a reading. If you want to schedule a reading, you can go to quietmindastrology.com/reading and join the waitlist. I will be opening some spaces in the near future. So if you want to get a reading, get on the waitlist. The waitlist gets priority, and I'll go in order of the time that people signed up to make availability. All right. Thanks for listening, and look forward to sharing more with you next time on the Quiet Mind Astrology Podcast.